Good morning. Welcome to our peer learning event this morning. My name is Andrew Geisert. I'm the Director of Economic Empowerment at LifeBridge Community Services. I'm also a member of the Peer Learning Committee of the Connecticut Asset Building Collaborative. I'm very excited about this morning's peer learning event for a couple of reasons, one of which is this is our first webinar-based peer learning event, so we have the ability to have people join us from throughout the state if they weren't able to be with us in the group that we have here in New Haven, so that's very exciting. I'm also very excited about the speaker we have, Brett Theodos, who's going to speak to us about the survey and research report that he had done on the financial coaching program. I don't know about you, but I get a lot of information in my email, a lot of information I'd love to read, and if I'm lucky, I get to read the executive summary of some of the stuff that comes in. But when I saw this particular research report, I took the time early morning on a Saturday the following weekend to read the entire report just because I was so intrigued and so interested. The report itself was extremely well done, and it was well worth the investment of my time to read it. So I'm really thrilled to have Brett with us this morning to join us and talk a little bit more about this great project that he was involved with. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. The presentation itself will probably run about 35-40 minutes. There will be opportunities for questions about halfway through and at the end of the presentation. For those folks that are joining us online through the webinar, there should be a box on your screen on the right-hand side where you can type in questions. For the group that we have here in New Haven, I think what we'll do is just invite you to come on up if you have a question to the podium, and you can ask your question directly to Brett over the microphone. So we'll try to alternate between the two groups there. We are taping this webinar as well, so once we're done with it, it'll be available online so people can, if they weren't able to join us, see it on the Connecticut Asset Building website.
If it works.
If it works. And I want to thank Roger Sensorick for being my technical assistance today and for setting up all the technology and making it work so well. So with that behind us, I would like to introduce our speaker, Brett Theodos. He's a senior research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center at the Urban Institute. His expertise is in program evaluation and performance measurement of interventions supporting vulnerable communities and families, including financial capability, asset building, employment and support programs, and affordable housing. Brett was the principal investigator on this study, which was a random control trial impact and implementation evaluation of 2 financial coaching programs. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brett.
Okay,
Great.
Brett.
Thanks so much.
Let me give you this.
Just confirming you all can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Great. And see the slides, confirming those are working as well.
Now you shall have it.
Okay. Good to go?
Yeah, I'll fix the screen here in a second. You can get going.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Andrew, and thanks everybody for turning out to hear about this talk. I certainly agree with Andrew's introduction that we all get more things in our email than we can possibly grapple with, but that is high praise to think that you took the time on a Saturday to read the report. I always joke that a report like this of 200 pages that I'm very happy if we get 200 readers. But thanks again to everybody for turning out, and excited to be able to share with you some of the findings that we've taken away from this evaluation, which is an important one for the field, I think, as it's learning about these kind of interventions. So I'm hoping, even though we're not all in the same room and it certainly makes it more difficult to interact, I'm hoping that we can be fairly interactive throughout this presentation. I really am offering these insights up just for your benefit. So while I've gone ahead and prepared some slides to structure the talk, I really do want to be responsive to the questions that you all are grappling with and thinking through and want to understand. So feel free to push me and prod me to slow down or speed up along the way. I've built in a couple different segments to the presentation. So what I'm going to do first is introduce the broader study, the specific type of intervention that I tested, and the population, the participants, those receiving the services, and how frequently they took up those services. So that's the first set of things that I'll talk to. And then at that point, I'm going to pause for some questions, some answers, some dialogue, reflections. That'll be the first half. And then the second half, I'll get into a discussion of what the outcomes, what the impacts were. So if you can think about it in those two halves, that'll help, and want to make sure that before we get to the outcomes, everybody's got a good handle on what the intervention is and who the people were that were receiving it. Okay, so there's me, so you don't just think I'm some disembodied voice floating off in the distance. And let's get going on the study background. So we evaluated 2 financial coaching programs. These are one-on-one client-based models where the client really drives what the activities are that are being undertaken. We looked at 2 programs. One is called Branches. It's in Miami-Dade County. And the other is the financial clinic down the road from you all based in New York City. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the presentation talking about the differences between coaching and counseling, but I will say in short that there are differences. There are reasons to think that the coaching approach is different, a complement in some ways. So in some cases it can be a substitute, but in other cases it's just a materially different thing than counseling. So for example, some of the differences might be counseling might be a more an activity that's more motivated by a specific issue or crisis. You could think of foreclosure counseling, or a need to get on a debt management plan, for example, whereas coaching would be a more broader set of activities potentially. It's more motivated by what the client, him or herself, feels that he or she wants to accomplish, and in that sense it really is a coaching function. So you could think of an executive coach or other coaching environments that you've been in. Of course, that's the theory, and then the practice, it gets always a little murkier of how much the coach does in terms of coaching versus teaching versus facilitating versus case management. There's a lot of different hats that the coach could be expected to play in some ways in reality. But that at least is the theory, and there's a lot more resources describing what coaching is out there, so if you're interested I can point you to some of those. The goals for these types of programs are varied because they reflect a varied set of client motivations, and there's the goals that people walk in with, what the financial clinic terms people's presenting issues, what they felt compelled by to show up that day. But that doesn't necessarily mean those are their goals that they're going to be keeping through their entire time of engagement with the program. But nevertheless, the common goals that we observed when we talked to people and when we surveyed them revolved around credit, around savings, around reducing existing debt, new loans, and other financial issues or services for low and moderate income people. And the target population is in that range typically for these types of programs, low, moderate income individuals. So the study that we undertook was what's called a randomized controlled trial study. This is considered the most rigorous approach to understanding programmatic impacts. And we looked at impacts in the areas of behavior, of knowledge, and of well-being. And so a random control trial study is the type of approach that at random assigns some people to get the service and some people not to. And the question that I always get next is, how is this ethical? How is it ethical to deny some people the service and to give it to other people? And the answer is, it's ethical only if the ability of the service providers to provide the service doesn't meet the potential need. So if we're in an atmosphere, in a scenario where there's more people who are interested in receiving a service than could possibly be provided for, then there needs to be some way to decide who is getting that service. And one of the most fair ways actually is to decide at random and give everybody an equal chance. And so we can take advantage of that need to decide who can get the services through deciding at random, at chance, who gets options for the services and who doesn't, and then follow both groups over time. It's worth saying for those of you who are not already familiar with these random control trial studies that the reason they're considered so valid, the reason they're considered so rigorous is that a lot of times in programs like financial coaching, but in other sorts of programs as well, the criticism that other types of studies are open to is that any gains that the people achieve that go through these programs weren't really caused by the programs themselves, but were motivated by inherent things within the clients. In other words, it's their self-motivation, their ability, their drive, their determination that brought through their objectives. So if we just look at the beginning and at the end for those who got the services without having that control group, it's hard to know if it was really just the people's own motivations and abilities that saw them make improvements, or it really was the program. And of course, it's the interaction of the two, but to be able to tease those out, we need to have this control group. So that's why these sorts of studies are a big investment. They don't come around every day. This particular study took 4 years to see from start to finish, but it's why I'm excited to be able to talk about it, because the fact that we were able to do it for not just one site, but for two, it's the first time this level of evidence has been brought to bear on anything, any financial coaching program. So that's just a very quick overview of RCTs, and it's worth saying as well that those who didn't get access to the services, i.e. those who were assigned to the control group, were offered the opportunity to receive them later after the study had wrapped up. Okay, so what we did in terms of conducting the evaluation was first to do a baseline survey, which we administered at application. Everybody had to fill in some basics about who they were and their financial conditions. That is, after they expressed an interest in participating in financial coaching and they understood what the study was involved. Then later, we administered a follow-up survey, and that started out online. For those people who didn't do it online, we called them on the phone. For those people who didn't do it on the phone, we visited them in person. And we got a decently high response rate for the follow-up survey, but that always is a challenge. And the other thing that we did is we were able to link up people's credit bureau records with their survey records, with their program administrative data. Skipped over that one. We also had records from the programs on how often people were served and when they were served and what they worked on. And we were able to link that also then with the baseline survey information. So we could look for a single individual and see them over time from baseline to service engagement to follow-up survey and with the credit bureau records. And we pulled those credit bureau records at about the same time as we did the follow-up survey. The follow-up survey, the length of time between the baseline and the follow-up depended on when people enrolled in the study. So we needed to do the follow-up survey and the follow-up credit bureau records all at the same point because it's a lot more expensive to do that on a rolling basis. But that meant that as people enrolled over the course of a year and a half, that some people had a longer time period between entry and follow-up, and others had a shorter. But that actually is in some ways intriguing because we could look at that. The other thing that we did was do a process or implementation study along with the random control trial study. And this is an important component because, well, the random control trial study allows us to say very rigorously with a lot of precision what happened. It doesn't allow us to say why or how. And so the process study, which we did a series of observations, we did interviews and focus groups with administrators, with coaches, with study participants, that allows us to get at the why and the how questions. And the RCT part of the study was funded by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the process study part was funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Okay, I'm going to turn next to enrollment and to take-up. So we had 945 study applicants across both sites. They enrolled in 2013 through 2014. We randomly assigned them to the treatment and the control group, again, effectively by flipping a coin with about half and half in each. In Miami, that study site principally enrolled people through outreach to county government departments. And the type of workers that they were outreaching to were those on the lowest pay scale of county government. So it was the people in Miami specifically who were doing things like trash collection, going out and doing mosquito control, some of the roads and bridges workers, the folks who are doing cleaning at the Port of Miami. So those types of employees. So these folks were fairly low wage, but they had steady employment. So in that ways, they were better off than some other populations, but also not especially high income. There was a small amount of the enrollment in branches that came also through some housing partners, where people went to some of these housing counseling groups, and the housing counseling group said, you're not ready yet. Please go see this financial coaching program and get ready before we're going to do counseling with you. And again, people were randomized into the treatment and the control, and the randomization was separate in Miami from New York. So in some very real sense, this is two separate studies, one in Miami and New York. Both could stand on their own. Now in New York, the enrollment pathway was different. People came in for VITA tax prep, and at that point, the financial clinic would say at the point of having completed their taxes, hey, we also do this financial coaching thing. Here's what it is. Here's what it involves. There's a study going on about it. Would you be interested in signing up for the option to receive these services? Some people said yes. We don't actually have a good sense of what share of people that were engaged through VITA sites said yes, they wanted to participate in the study. And also the financial clinic did workshops at some partner sites. So their program model, in addition to the VITA efforts, is that they are co-located with other service providing agencies a day a week or a morning a week at a domestic violence shelter, or they were at a union, they're at a library, other locations around the city. And that's where they would do a workshop, and as part of the workshop then, they would also say at the end of that, and if you're interested in some more intensive and ongoing services, you could sign up to participate. Some brief demographics of what the study participants looked like, these 945 people. There's some similarities and some differences between the Miami site and the New York site. So age is roughly comparable, gender's not too different, very different in terms of marital status, whereas at branches, 44% were married. At the financial clinic, just 15% were. Fewer children in the household in New York than in Miami. Racial ethnic compositions in the Miami site, it was 60+% Black, so it was not just the Latino community that was engaged there, but there was a fair share of Hispanics and Latinos in Miami. In New York, it was pretty evenly split between those two groups, though also some white. Looking at the study participants' financial conditions at baseline, we saw much higher employment rates in Miami than in New York, and that made sense. The people who were entering this program in Miami were mostly through these county agencies, whereas in New York, just 43% were employed full-time or self-employed. We asked people to self-report their household income, and we calculated it on an after-tax basis. And in Miami, it's approaching $40,000 for the household. In New York, it's just on average $22,000, which, as you no doubt know, is not a lot of money to live on for a household in New York. In terms of checking and savings accounts, a number of people had them, though they were more prevalent in Miami than they were in New York. We also looked at credit scores, and these were baseline credit scores. That we got these after the fact at the point where we pulled the scores at the end, but we were able to also get the credit bureau information for earlier in the study. And so what you can see here is that both sites, the credit scores are fairly low, below 600, though they are also lower in the New York site than they are in the Miami site on average. Directly deposited paycheck, again, this is of those who are working, so much higher in branches with the county employees. A fair share have a credit card, but certainly not everyone. And then there is some signs of financial distress when we look at the percent of people who have a balance past due, approaching a quarter of all of these people in the New York site. We also look at, there's a number of people who have items in collections. Okay, so the next key question, after we understand who the people were that were interested in the service, who signed up for the study, what did they look like at the point that they signed up, is what is the take-up? What was, even of those assigned to this treatment group, so we flipped this coin, and then half of the people were assigned to the treatment group, how many of them actually showed up to receive the service? And it's pretty striking here, as you can see, that a lot of people didn't show up. So the show up rate in the take-up rate in Miami was just 38%. And in New York, it was just 55%. Now, of those who showed up, they showed up, some of them one time, some of them 2, 3, 4, and 5+. So you can see there the range, the distribution of show-ups across the 2 sites. So definitely a higher show-up rate in New York than in Miami, reflecting, I think, in part some greater outreach efforts there by that site. But even in that site, a number of people who said they were interested in this service didn't follow through on their interest. And we have a whole chapter in the report describing why that's the case after talking to people. And I'm not going to give a detailed explanation here, but I think this is an important finding when we think about what services and supports are needed for people that are voluntary in nature. Even those who are interested in them may not actually follow through on receiving them, or they may not follow through as much as we think they need to in order to make the gains that we are hoping and they are hoping that they will achieve. So I think this is an important finding for the field to grapple with, that reasons for not showing up are as varied as you could imagine. Well, I thought I wanted to, but then I realized it's 2 different bus rides away and it doesn't work. Or my schedule shifted, because a lot of employment is flexible in a bad way. My schedule got shifted and it no longer works for me to get there. Or my childcare arrangements fell through, or what have you, any possible number of things. So that is the take-up rate. Now, it's important to note the implications for our ability to test what it is that we are going to test in terms of an outcome, because when we look at this treatment group and this control group, when I describe the treatment group, I'm describing everybody on the slide, including those zeros. In other words, when we flip that coin and we put some people in the treatment group and some people in the control group, if we're going to be able to get away from the criticism of the effects just being driven by self-selection, self-motivation, we need to include those who didn't show up, because we only know that this treatment group and this control group is comparable on the basis of the randomization. Because at random, the treatment group is going to look like the control group. But when we start looking at those who showed up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5+ time and compare that to the control group, then we're again open to this criticism of self-selection, because maybe those who showed up 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 times are just more motivated than those who didn't show up, and that's why they're doing better. So we'll be able to look at both. We'll be able to look at the outcomes for all of these people in the treatment group, including the zeros, and we'll be able to look at the outcomes just for the people who showed up. And there'll be some interesting findings along the way along those lines. Okay, so let me pause there. I've just thrown a lot at you in terms of what this intervention is, what the populations are, and how often they show up. So let me pause there and take some questions and try to clarify anything, and then we will press on into what the outcome findings were.
Okay.
Hi there, this is Annie Harper. Just a quick question. Were people paid any kind of compensation for signing up for the study?
Great question, and let me also ask the compensation about the coaches themselves. So there's a modest compensation for participating in the study. There was no compensation at sign up, but there was at the point of completing the outcomes survey. It's less of a payment per se and more of a thank you. So it was on the order of, I think, $40, which obviously is not nothing, but you know, we're also not wanting to coerce people and make the incentive too high that they feel that they have to participate even if they don't want to. So on but one other question that comes up sometimes is on these models, the coaches, a different kind of compensation question, the coaches were compensated. These were not volunteer coaches. They were paid staff on staff with these organizations.
I just ask a quick follow-up question. So is there any possibility that the high drop-off rate after signing up for the study may have been because you've got people who are primarily interested in getting payment for being part of the study and less interested in the service?
Sorry, sorry, having a hard time hearing that. Could you mind trying again?
So the question was, I was just wondering if there's any possibility that the high drop-off rate of people who joined the study but then didn't follow through with the coaching, might that have been partly because they were motivated as much by the payment for joining the study as by the promise of the coaching program?
So I think I heard about a third of that. I'm going to try to answer it, and hopefully I was directionally right. The question was, were people incentivized to sign up for the coaching even though they weren't really interested in it because of payment for participating in the study? The reverse, sorry.
No, that was the question.
That was the question. Okay, great. Always something that we grapple with, and that's actually why we didn't pay people up front, because we didn't want people to say, yeah, even for a smallish amount of money, yes, I'll fill out this paperwork, but I'm not at all interested. But you know, the follow-up survey was up to 18 months after the sign-up point. So I think it's hard to know, but the thought that a lot of people signed up for potentially getting $40 18 months from now is, I think, not very high. Also because there's a cost to signing up in the sense that we're poking and prodding in people's personal lives and asking them how much money they make and how satisfied they are with their finances and how stressed they are. And most people don't enjoy that process of getting asked those questions. And so, in fact, when we looked at actually fielding the outcome survey, I actually wish the opposite. I wish the $40 were more of an incentive, but it's a heroic task to try to engage people in surveys nowadays, even when they've agreed to participate in something. And so our survey response rates were in New York on the order of 70%, and in Miami just on the order of 55%. So there's a lot of people who actually didn't even get the $40 because they didn't follow through and complete the follow-up survey.
Hi, Brett. My name is Joy Duva. I just wondered if you came to any thoughts or conclusions about whether the program model, if more flexible, might have drawn more people. So if those who never showed up, some of them might have shown up if this coaching could have been done by phone or online or something like that?
It's a great question. These coaching models did start in person, and they emphasized that, though they did broaden out the aperture from that point to do some email communication, even text, even talk on the phone. But yes, there are programs that are more explicitly telephone-based. So I can't inform that through this study. I just saw a different study that looked at take-up rates for online and telephone and in person, and somewhat surprisingly, it didn't actually find that high a difference. But I think the underlying question there is right in the sense that some people may prefer to engage online or by telephone or in person, and allowing them those choices may help to meet their various needs and situations. So I think that could help. The other thing that I wanted to note about the Miami site is that service provider branches, they actually tried to do the coaching on site at the job locations. And on the one hand, this is really promising. On the other hand, it's not. And on the promising department is you're removing a lot of the burden of getting the help. These people are already there. They're at their jobs. And the difficulty of needing to drive somewhere else and work it into your schedule is just removed. And the supervisors were supportive and would allow people time during their day, during their lunch hour, to be released to receive these services. So on the one hand, we would think that's really an intriguing model, is how this can be done on the workplace and in that way limit the burden on people's lives. But it's not always so easy in a couple senses. One, the people whose jobs it were at these types of county offices had hours that are not 9 to 5 and had jobs that were often making them drive all around the city. So doing the mosquito control, they're not sitting in an office. Doing the trash collection, they're not sitting in the office. Cleaning in the port, they're not sitting in the office. And so that certainly is a barrier. It's a lot harder to have an on-site job program if the employees themselves are not often or always on site. And then there were also just some psychological barriers where people were in some ways averse to be seen as getting help in front of their colleagues, of recognizing or saying that they had a problem in some ways. The meeting spaces were not always well set up to be private and allow for very personal conversations. So there was a lot of implementation issues there that I think made it more challenging on the workforce side. But it's intriguing to think about whether that could work. One last comment about it is that there were also some interesting differences by gender there, in particular with some of the take-up among males and enrollment not being as high or as successful as it was with females.
Brett, hi, it's Andrew again. Not to put you too much on the spot, but you had mentioned it's a 4-year study and the work involved with the follow-up and things like that. Are you able to share even an approximation of what the budget was or what the cost was for completing this whole exercise?
Absolutely, yeah, I don't mind at all. So the process study was about $150,000. It could be done probably cheaper if you only looked at one program or you only looked at a more discrete time period, but we are covering a couple of years and a couple of programs. And we're also writing a pretty extensive and detailed synopsis and summary of that. But I think for process studies at their cheapest, you're going to think around something in the $75K range, but for something more robust in the 100 to 150 range. So that's the process study part. On the impact study, a lot depends on the data collection costs. So the total cost of the RCT was about $1.1 million, but several $100,000 of that was given over to a survey firm to do the survey work. Also, I should say that included hosting multiple convenings for CFPB and doing another separate research brief. So it would be somewhat less than that just to do the study itself, maybe let's say 900,000. And then of that, the survey costs would be maybe on the order of 300,000. So again, a lot depends on what kind of product you envision, whether there's multiple sites, how many people you're enrolling, how long you're following them, and whether you're doing an in-depth survey that's expensive to do, to field, to track people, and to compensate them for incentives. But I've done a number of RCT studies, and all of them have been somewhere in the range of 500,000 to 2 million. I guess there's one outlier that's 6 million because it's a really big study, but you could think in that range. And for anybody that's interested in thinking about this, I'd be happy to have a little sidebar conversation to give you some more specific thoughts about your situation.
That's great. You know, I think a lot of times we struggle, I'll just speak again for myself, we struggle in just generating the support that we need, the financial support we need just to implement the programs, let alone build around some of these types of things where we track the outcomes and have money to follow up as extensively as you guys did. So that's very helpful to know.
Yeah, I mean, two other really quick thoughts to that. One is that you know, the programs didn't fundraise for this study. You know, I found the money and then I found the programs rather than the reverse. It can work in the reverse, and there are funders that are interested in paying for research and evaluation that are not interested in the program operation sides of things. So I think I've seen ways to do this where it doesn't need to cannibalize the existing fundraising support for those who are interested. And the other thing I'll mention is that another project that I'm doing, I'm leading something called Measure for Change, which is sponsored by the World Bank, where we're building the capacity of nonprofits to do performance measurement and evaluate themselves. So rather than some external evaluator coming in and doing some big study, this is trying to build the capacity of the nonprofits to track their own outputs, outcomes, their achievements. And you know, I'd be happy to talk at greater length at some point about that, but I mean, some just very high-level reactions are that, one, of course, it's hard, and of course, it's also hard to identify funding for it. But two, there are some relatively straightforward both data software products to use, and in this particular field, some outcome metrics to track. And third, the credit bureau data are actually quite inexpensive relative to the survey data, and allow for some really nice and objective measures of how people are faring over time. So there are a lot of cheaper ways that the program, for its own sake, can understand what its activities are and its outcomes or accomplishments are.
All right, great. I think that's the questions that we have for the moment, Brett. So if you'd like, you can continue with the second piece.
Will do. Okay, great. So I've structured it around a couple broad buckets, the first of which looks at savings and at debt. So I'm going to spend a little bit longer on this first table to orient you to how to interpret the tables, and then from there I will go a little bit quicker. Okay, so this first table looks at the number of savings deposits at both sites. These are literally the number of times that people put money into their savings account. This could be because of direct deposits, but it could be just their cash deposits. It's worth saying that you know, this is self-reported. We don't have people's bank data, so that's as we go through these various outcomes, some of them are going to be self-reported. Those are from the survey, and then some of them are going to be from the credit bureau records. So we have here as the rows, the two sites, branches, and the financial clinic. And then the next column that I show you there, called control mean, that's the average for the control group. So in Miami, the control group, which again didn't get access to these services. So these people are exactly like the treatment people on average, it's just they didn't have the access to these services. So the only difference between the control mean and the treatment mean, on average, is the access to these services. Now again, not everybody in the treatment group actually took up these services, but what they had is the offer of these services. And so what you see here is that the control mean was 13.7 and the treatment mean was 15.6. So the very simple way to think about whether there was an effect is, what's the difference between the control mean and the treatment mean? Because they're supposed to be the same on average at baseline, and after baseline the only thing that differs is access to the services. So if there's a difference between those two numbers, we can attribute that difference to the intervention itself. And so that's the kind of most simple and straightforward understanding of whether there's a programmatic effect. Now, of course, it's never quite that simple and straightforward in research speak, because while these groups are supposed to be exactly identical at baseline, if you flip a coin 10 times, you might get 6 heads and 4 tails rather than 5 and 5. And so just by chance, especially with numbers that are not in the thousands and thousands, you're going to get small differences between the treatment and the control group, the 6 heads and the 4 tails rather than the 5 and 5. So one group might be just a little bit higher income, or might be a little bit lower this or that. And so what we do is we introduce some controls. We put it in a regression framework. We introduce some controls at baseline to try to get at, with some more precision, what the difference between that 13.7 number is and that 15.6 number is. And that's the third column, which is called intent to treat, the regression adjusted. And so that is effectively the difference between the treatment mean and the control mean, just introducing some controls. And so what you see there is, in the branches site, it's 2.6 about. So you can say that for the treatment group on average made about 2.6 more deposits into their savings or checkings accounts than did the control group. And so you can say that the offer of financial coaching increased or improved the number of savings deposits. And that was true at branches, and we can move down a row and see that was also true at the financial clinic. I'm starting with this indicator because when I started the study and asked the folks, especially at the financial clinic, what is the one measure of success for your organization? Because as we've talked about, there's so many different measures of success for these broad-focused interventions that are driven by client objectives. It's not a simple, debt management plan. It's not foreclosure counseling, which have much more discrete objectives. It's varied. And the folks at the financial clinic at least said, what's most important to us is that people begin to establish a behavior of savings, a pattern. And so here's the first indicator that shows that indeed people are making more deposits and savings. So that's the third column, this intent to treat. That means we're looking at all the treatment groups, the 0s, the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, 5s. Then the last column is what's called this treatment on the treated. So what we're trying to do there with some statistical processes and controls is say, okay, we know that 2.6 number is true for everybody in the treatment group, but what if we make some assumptions, and what if we assume that those who didn't show up at all did not benefit from the program? Sounds like a reasonable assumption that those who didn't show up didn't benefit. And if we make that assumption, then we can do some estimates about what the effect was for those who actually did show up. And so almost always the effect for the treatment on the treated, those who did show up actually, is going to be higher than this intent to treat, those who were just offered the service. Because the intent to treat is in effect watering down the estimate of the benefit by including all those people who didn't show up. And again, remember, in branches, only 38% of people showed up, and in New York, only 55% of people showed up. And so from an evaluation perspective, it's actually really impressive that there would be an overall effect for the treatment group if only a fraction of the treatment group took up the service. That means that those who did take up the service really benefited if they're carrying the water for everybody in that treatment group, in that intent to treat regression. So you can see from the last column, the treatment on the treated regression is that the estimates there, that is for people who actually showed up, are appreciably higher, above 5, above 3 deposits on average difference between the treatment group and the control group. Okay, so hopefully this starts to make sense, this table and the structure and what I'm describing here. I'm going to run through a number of other outcomes to give you a sense of some of the where we also did and didn't see differences by the program, and we'll press on. Okay, the next thing we looked at was total account balance. What we saw here, interestingly, was an increase in savings amounts at the financial clinic, but we did not see a corresponding increase at branches. Now, you could be saying to yourselves, but I see the number 791 in the third column, which is effectively the difference between the first two columns. What you don't see there is a little asterisk after that. And what the asterisks indicate is are having some confidence statistically that that number is different from 0. So you'll see below it the 1187 financial clinic number. We are confident statistically that that number is different than 0. So we will talk about that as a real effect, whereas the branches number, even though it may not look all that different from the 1187, we won't talk about that as a real effect, just given the statistical level of significance that we're using there. And so, getting to the content for a minute, it's interesting. I mean, what we see here, the control mean at the financial clinic, $1,300. The treatment mean almost $200. That's a really big difference in percentage terms. And people whose average incomes, again, were just $22,000, to be able to save almost $1,200 is a lot of savings. So on the one hand, I think it could be easy to look at that as not a lot of money, but given where people are starting at and given where they're at in terms of the control group, it is pretty striking to me that they did make appreciable changes there. Okay, so looking at branches, you can see that there was indeed some maybe trending upwards, but we can't say that statistically. But we do see that there is still pretty low savings levels, even at the branches site. I'm getting a notice on my screen that the connection with the GoToWebinar server has been lost. So if that poses a problem, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to keep talking.
Yeah, Brett,
okay.
we can still hear you here, at least in New Haven.
Okay, great. All right, so the next slide that I'm looking at is total debt. So we looked at savings, now let's look at debt. And what we see here, just starting with those control means, so we get a picture of what people are looking at like without the program, is very much higher levels of debt in branches than at the financial clinic. Now this isn't surprising. Actually, what happens is that people with higher incomes up to a point have higher debts. So whereas the folks who are really low earners in New York aren't able to access as much debt, those in branches are. They have stable jobs, so they have car debts and a boat and a number of other types of debts. And so what can be seen there is, one, just the difference in debts between the two sides, but then two, looking at the changes from the treatment and the control group, that third column, we can see a pretty sizable reduction in debt levels at branches, not a corresponding difference in debt levels that we can again state statistically at the financial clinic. And in some ways, you might think this makes perfect sense. So
sorry, Brad,
the folks, yep.
We cannot see the data slide.
Okay. I don't know how to help you.
Okay, let me do something. Whoops. For some reason,
Can you
it's
see it
not
now?
I'll give you the screen again now.
Okay. Oh, here we are.
Yeah, now it
Okay.
works.
Now it works.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Yep. No. Absolutely. Okay. So I'll just recap this slide very briefly. So what you're seeing is that debt levels went down quite a bit in the Miami site. And you might think this makes perfect sense because the people in New York didn't have very high of debt levels. What they're working on is increasing their emergency savings, their cushion, whereas the people in branches had very high levels of debt, and what they're working on is decreasing their debt levels. All this is, of course, on average. And so what you see is some differences in the outcomes achieved, even though the interventions are somewhat similar based on the populations, based on the needs of the people who are walking through the door. Okay, the next metric that we looked at was curing, which is a technical term that the credit bureau uses, which is the number of trades. A trade is like a loan, like a credit card, for example, that is now satisfactory that used to be delinquent or derogatory. So this is a measure of you're improving, you're changing. You used to be delinquent or derogatory in your credit card, and now you're not. And so how many accounts did you do that for? And you can see that at both branches and the financial clinic, there were improvements in curing. So one of the things these programs are influencing people to do is to get their credit accounts out of a status of delinquency and derogatory on average. Next, we looked at the effect of paying a late fee. This is self-reported information on a bill in the last 2 months. Here we saw that there was an effect in Miami, but there was not an effect at the financial clinic. We looked at a measure that we calculated, which is income being greater than the sum of household living expenses. We didn't see that measure improved at either site. We also did not see, we looked at a few different types of alternative financial services. We didn't see an overall effect on using any of the alternative financial services at either site. But one thing that does stand out as really interesting to me is that so payday lending is not legal in New York, but it is in Florida. And so we actually did see an improvement, meaning a reduction in payday loan taking in Miami. Something like the control group used payday loans on the order of 29% had used it, and the treatment group on the order of 21%. So there was a reasonably sized reduction in payday use in Miami. Now in New York there wasn't, but keep in mind the control group was not really using payday. So even in Miami, or even in New York, where it was illegal, people can get it from the internet, and so maybe roughly about 5% of people in New York received a payday loan in the control group. It's just worth, I'm bringing this all up to say that social services are but one tool in the toolkit of how to improve consumers' finances. And here is a scenario where we saw improvements we saw reductions in payday loan use in Miami. But even so, even for that treatment group that saw improvements, their use of payday was still more than 4 times what it was in New York, where payday just wasn't legal at all. So this is just one small example of how policy and regulation can intersect with social services and producing outcomes or not. But in some ways, not producing outcomes may actually still be better than producing them, comparing New York and Miami. Okay, looking at a few other outcomes, the next bucket I've termed credit scores and also budgeting. So this is, I think, one of the most important metrics, and it had the folks in New York very happy, and that is that we detected a change, an increase in credit scores on the order of 21 points. That's a really big increase in credit score for a very vulnerable population over a fairly short amount of time. And for the treatment on the treated estimates, those who actually showed up on the even higher, in the 30s. And so what we see there are some pretty robust increases in credit score at the financial clinic. We do not see the corresponding increases, interestingly, at the Miami site. The other thing we looked at is the share of people who reported they had a budget. From our qualitative work, we saw that those at the financial clinic were, they heavily stressed having a budget, and indeed we see a statistical effect with much higher rates of having a budget in New York for the treatment group than the control. No difference in the Miami site. Interestingly, then in the survey we asked them not just do they have a budget, but do they stick to it, and there was no effect of that measure at either site. The last bucket of outcomes that I will look at relate to financial stress, satisfaction, and knowledge. It's really not often that in one research study we can get an understanding of people's quote-unquote objective financial pictures as well as their perceptions about their financial state. And it's I think a much richer picture of how people's financial lives are lived to have both of those types of information. And it was very interesting for this particular study that there was a lot of congruence between what people's objective financial pictures were and what they were perceiving. And that's, on the one hand, heartening to those of us who worry about how we're measuring things, but also, of course, at another level, just makes basic sense. Okay, so here's a measure we looked at, the effect of the level of financial stress at branches, and we saw a reduction there. This is a scale that we calculated, so an improvement there for branches of about a half a point on a 1 to 7 scale. We don't detect a statistical difference at the financial clinic. We looked at the effect of satisfaction, people's self-reported satisfaction with their present financial situation. And again, we see an effect of about the same order of magnitude in branches, not in New York. The other thing that we looked at, and this is the last finding slide that I'll show you, is the effect on financial knowledge. So we asked a series of test quiz questions, 8 of them, and we tried to tailor them as best we could to the types of knowledge that we thought would be relevant to this target set of consumers. We then calculated how many of those questions people got right. Now, it should be said, these are abstracted financial knowledge questions. These are general knowledge questions, but you know, they're not the very specific things of how do I get on an income-based repayment program for my student loan. It's bigger picture things about like how would inflation affect your savings, that sort of thing. So it's worth observing here that there was no improvement in financial knowledge, at least as we measured it. Surely we did see through the qualitative work that people were gaining specific knowledge relevant to their specific individual decisions. So getting on that student income-based repayment plan, people learned about that, but they learned to the extent that they had a problem about the thing that they were working on. Not about a general financial literacy or education intervention. So this raises questions. I mean, I don't think many people think that financial literacy is unimportant, but it does raise questions about the extent to which the gains that were made through these programs really derive from behavioral interventions that the coach and the client were doing vis-a-vis financial abstracted knowledge benefits. Okay, so I'll run you through a few implications and then to have whatever time we have left for questions. So first, financial coaching as practiced today varies in many aspects of its implementation. I didn't get a chance to dwell on that, but that's detailed in the report. Next, we saw that clients have differing financial goals and motivations. It's clear that financial coaching is not the solution for all low and moderate income individuals. A number of people, when offered the service, said, no, I don't want it. And a number of people who said, yes, I do want it, didn't show up for it. So it's clear that this service is not for everyone. On the other hand, for those who are interested in it, it's also clear, using the most rigorous test available and not allowing self-selection to be a factor in the findings, that nevertheless, even given low take-up, there were sizable outcomes under this study, which certainly indicates, at least to us, that the approach has some promise. Also, we saw that the effects differed quite a bit between the two sites. And there could be a number of reasons for that related to who the population was, but also some differences in delivering the services. But all that does provide some amount of caution about how well one particular site's results can be extrapolated to other populations and to other programs. So here's the report link available. It's on our website, urban.org. It's got a lot more information than I was able to cover today. But I know that we're getting close to time, if not at it. But if people have time for questions, I'm happy to chat as long as that takes.
So, Brett, I think we might have one or two here in New Haven, but if they come up just a moment to ask their questions. One thing that I noticed, and I think is correct, at the branch's site in Miami, I thought there were two things that were kind of somewhat contradictory. One was that there was shown some progress in paying down outstanding debts, but it had seemed like there was no impact on credit scores. And I wonder if you had a thought as to like how you could have one and not the other.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a number of things that go into credit score. Accounts being delinquent is one of them, certainly. Your credit utilization is one of them, certainly. The length of time that people have had a credit account is certainly one of them. And the types of credit that you hold is also one. So debt levels per se are not big drivers of credit score, except insofar as they're reflected in credit utilization. Meaning, what share of your available credit you're using. I guess all that to say is, even though there were sizable reductions in debt, that doesn't necessarily, depending on the type of debt it is, you could think about a car loan versus a credit card, translate into something that the credit bureau sees as a reduction in the share of credit that's available to you that you're actually holding. And then even where that does translate, that's only one factor among others in determining what your credit score is. So I think what probably was more important in driving the changes is getting accounts cured and some of the work to clean up some of the things on the credit reports that were either errant or could be paid down. For example, the person who I observed that had a $75 delinquent account for a water bottle delivery service that had been years old and they hadn't even understood would show up on their credit report. Getting that stuff cleared up and either paid off or disputed and resolved and off of the credit report in the short term is going to be a clearer path forward in terms of improving credit score. But yes, certainly we would also expect credit utilization to affect score as well.
Good morning, Brett. I just had a question about your confidence in kind of the self-report data. I know it's important, of course, in an RTC is the difference between the two groups, but I just wonder if any of the difference that you see in the treatment group, it could be attributed to the treatment group's understanding of what, for example, would be a good answer to the number of deposits or the change in account balance, or, the coaching having an effect on their understanding of what good answers would be, right, might affect over positive reporting from the treatment group. Or are you feeling pretty confident about the self-reported in terms of frequency of deposits and account balances?
Yeah, I mean, a great question, something we think a lot about, which is, the Hawthorne effect, how much is our measuring them influencing it because they're trying to give us the answer we want to hear, or, the teaching to the test kind of thing is, how much is the intervention really affecting just the measurement versus their actual lives. So I don't think there's easy answers to those types of questions, but a couple of quick thoughts. One, it's nice to see the corresponding evidence between the credit bureau records and the self-reported records. And so when we see people's debt levels going down and the share of delinquent accounts going down, then you know, when people say that they feel less financially stressed, that makes sense. These things are pointing in the same direction, so that gives some measure of confidence in the findings. The other thing is, it's important to note that, you know, as I have said at several points, like in branches, for example, not everybody showed up for the service. So certainly we wouldn't expect those who didn't show up to have had an effect. So it is just really those treated individuals that we need to think about. But also, you know, even them showing up 1 or 2 times, a number of them, we try to frame the survey as an independent effort. You know, the coaches don't administer the survey themselves. They're not doing it in the coaches' offices. We're trying to represent it as a neutral and third-party thing. So we're hopeful that the results are real, but that's something that we always give thought to.
Brett, I think we have one more question, and then we'll probably wrap it up.
Yep.
Hi, Brett. Just speaking of the coaches again, were there differences between the coaches in the 2 sites in terms of training, certifications, being paid versus volunteer, or anything else that you may have noticed?
Yes, there were, and we do go into that in detail in the report. A very quick synopsis at this point is both of the programs mostly, though not exclusively, relied on professional coaches. The not exclusively part would include people that were doing what, for example, the financial clinic called financial fellows, like a 1-year volunteer, you know, AmeriCorps or Teach for America type experience, a shorter term. People coming out of, for example, out of getting a bachelor's degree and then going and doing this for a short amount of time. So those would be the people I would not characterize as professional coaches in the sense that they've been doing it for years and see this as their career. But both sites did not rely on volunteer coaches, people who had just come in for 1 hour a month with 1 client. That sort of thing was not part of these program models. In terms of certification or credentialing, these programs did not use some of the available certification or credentialing systems that are out there. I know that some of those, the field is rapidly evolving in this sense. Both of them have built in-house training curricula and have been using that to help orient their coaches and oversee them. You know, for example, the financial clinic has what they call a toolkit, where by domain or by topic, they've got a set of resource guides that are available to the coaches to walk through with their clients. They have integrated those into their online system, their platform that they're calling Change Machine. And so there's definitely resources available, but in terms of their backgrounds and education degrees, we've got more description in the report about that too.
All right, Brett, I'm going to make you the good guy or the bad guy. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Hi, it's Annie Harper again. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Okay, so the question is, did you also look at cost effectiveness in terms of how much the programs cost compared to the impact on the people they work with?
I didn't get to do that. That wasn't part of our mandate from CFPB, but if there's any funders in the room that would like us to look at that, I would be very happy. It's an important question, and I think that it's one that's very answerable, even at this point, because it's easy to track down how much the services cost. They're mostly attached to labor for the coaches, as well as some amount of facilities and technology costs, but those will be smaller. And then the benefit side, it's always a little bit difficult to monetize, but in this case, some of the things could be monetized fairly well in terms of savings and debts. And then some of them are harder, like the perceptual stuff around satisfaction and stress, but it could be done. So that's where we're at with it, though.
Well, great. I would just like to wrap things up a bit. I'd certainly like to thank you, Brett, for the terrific presentation, every bit as good as the report itself, and very informative for us here. I'd also like to thank the people that joined us, remotely through the webinar, and the people who have joined us here in New Haven, and Roger certainly for his assistance in pulling this off, technically speaking. So I think we did pretty well for our first time out. But thanks to everyone, and hopefully you'll hear from us about a next peer learning event.